You've waited. You've wondered. You've asked yourself again and again, where did they go? Well, today you're about to hear the truth. Jonathan and Suzy Lamb are no longer in the shadow of Daystar. They're not just the faces you once saw on a network screen. They are now standing in their own place, leading their own mission, shaping their own path. I want you to imagine this moment. You switch on your TV one morning, and you notice something is missing. No Jonathan. No Suzy. The familiar voices, gone. For some people, it was just another day's program change. But for others, for those who followed their journey for years, it was the start of a mystery. This wasn't just a quiet change behind the scenes. It was a break. A sudden one. Jonathan had been the son of Marcus and Joni Lamb, the very family that built Daystar from the ground up. Suzy had been his partner on screen and in life, co-hosting The Green Room, sitting beside him in interviews, traveling with him to events. To the audience they looked steady. They looked secure. But inside, things were shifting. And then, November 16, 2024, it became official. Jonathan Lamb was out. Not for a holiday. Not for a time away. The words Daystar used were careful. They spoke about deficiencies in judgment and performance. Language that left people with more questions than answers. Suzy? She was gone even earlier, quietly in June 2023. No big announcement. No farewell segment. Just gone. And when that happened, it wasn't just the end of a job. It was the end of a chapter. Think about it. Jonathan had spent his life in the world of Daystar. He was raised in it. It was his family's voice, his family's vision, his family's platform. To walk away from that, or be pushed away from it, was more than a career change. It was leaving home. Now here's where the story turns. Instead of disappearing from view, instead of hiding away in silence, they began to move. They didn't go to another TV network. They didn't go to some safe media job. No, they moved to Arizona. Chandler, to be exact. A different pace. A different skyline. A different life. Far from the familiar halls of the Daystar studio, far from the Texas headquarters, far from the cameras they grew up in front of. Why Arizona? For them, it wasn't just a random choice. It was a place where they could breathe, where they could think, where they could decide who they were without the constant pull of someone else's brand. And it was in Arizona that they started the first steps of something new. A ministry of their own. Not a giant TV empire. Not a copy of Daystar. Something more personal. Something that came from their own hearts, not from a boardroom agenda. One of their first moves? A podcast. A space where they could speak freely. No teleprompter. No network boss editing the message. Just their voices, telling their side of the story, sharing what they've learned, speaking directly to people who cared enough to listen. And it didn't stop there. They began appearing at events. Not just as guests, but as featured voices. The kind of events where the audience is small enough that you can see every face, shake every hand. The kind of settings where you can pray with people one by one, not just speak to a camera lens. One big date stands out, July 7, 2025. The Restore Conference at Crossroads Nazarene Church in Chandler. That's not just a random appearance. That's a statement. Says we're here now. We're doing this our way. There's also talk, though not yet officially confirmed, of something called Lamb and Lion Ministries. Some say it's theirs. Some say it's still just forming. Either way, the signs are there. The name, the events, the public talks, it all points to one thing. Jonathan and Suzy are building something independent. Now here's the part I want you to really think about. When you've spent years being part of something massive, a network with global reach, millions of viewers, resources at your fingertips, it's easy to get comfortable. It's easy to stay even if the inside story is messy. But leaving? Starting from scratch? That takes risk. That takes courage. Jonathan and Suzy didn't choose the easy road. And whether you agree with them or not, whether you see them as heroes or as people with something to prove, you can't deny this. They stepped out into the unknown. They walked away from a stage where the spotlight was already on them, to start a stage of their own. And that's where we begin this journey. Not in the glamour of TV studios. Not in the comfort of family-run media. But in a new place with new voices, new hopes, and new battles ahead. If you've ever been in a place for a long time, you know the signs. The little things that tell you something is changing. A tone in someone's voice. A meeting that feels different. An unspoken tension in the air. For Jonathan and Suzy, those signs began long before the public knew anything. To the viewers, Daystar looked the same as always. The lights were bright. The music played. The guests smiled. But behind the scenes, there were cracks. Not big noisy cracks at first. Small ones. The kind you only see when you're close enough to notice the details. Jonathan had been carrying more weight than before. Not just in work, but in responsibility. Since Marcus Lamb's passing in 2021, the balance of the network had shifted. Joni Lamb was the face. Jonathan was expected to be the steady hand behind her. That sounds simple, but it wasn't. It meant carrying the family name and the family expectations. And every decision he made was watched. Every word he said was remembered. Suzy felt it too. She was part of the network family now, not just by marriage but by years of work. Her role on The Green Room wasn't just a show, it was a bridge to younger viewers, a softer space in a network often filled with heavy, formal programming. But she could sense her place was shifting. Opportunities she once had were slowing down. Conversations she used to be part of were happening without her. Then came the performance reviews. Not the normal kind. These were deep, drawn out, and some say unusually tense. Jonathan was told there were concerns. Not about ratings. Not about his faith. But about judgment. About choices. And those words, judgment and performance, would later appear in the public statement when he was let go. It's one thing to be critiqued by a boss. It's another when the boss is your own family. That changes everything. By mid-2023, Suzy's position had faded completely. She was gone from the set, gone from the lineup. No farewell episode. No chance to thank the viewers who'd followed her. She just vanished from the screen. Jonathan stayed longer. But staying didn't mean things were steady. Meetings grew sharper. Decisions got harder. And the space for him to lead grew smaller. By the fall of 2024, it was clear something was coming. He may not have known the exact day, but he knew. You can't work in a place all your life and miss those signs. And then, on November 16th, it happened. The announcement came. Not from Jonathan. Not from Suzy. From Daystar. It was official. He was no longer part of the network. No long goodbye. No closing words to the audience. Just a sudden end. For the viewers, it was a shock. Some didn't believe it. Some thought it was temporary. But for Jonathan and Suzy, it was permanent. And it forced a question they'd never had to ask before. What do we do now? They could have gone quiet. They could have walked away from ministry work entirely. They could have taken safe jobs and lived quietly out of the public eye. But that's not what they chose. Within weeks, they were making calls. Meeting people. Planning something that wasn't about holding on to the past, but about building something new. They looked at what they'd learned, the good and the bad, and began shaping a ministry that reflected their hearts, not just their history. And in that space between the end of one chapter and the start of another, the seeds of their Arizona move were planted. Leaving is never easy. It doesn't matter if it's a job, a city, or a life you've known for years. When you leave, you feel it. You feel it in your chest. You feel it in your hands as you pack boxes. You feel it in the silence when you walk through a room for the last time. For Jonathan and Suzy, Texas wasn't just where they worked. It was home. It was where they built memories, where they celebrated holidays, where they raised their children. It was where the network was, the building that had been part of their lives for decades. Every hallway there held echoes of the past. Leaving it behind wasn't just about changing an address. It was about closing the door on a whole season of their lives. In the weeks after Jonathan's exit, the house grew quieter. Not just because of the news, but because the decision was already forming. They were going to start fresh. And starting fresh meant somewhere new. Arizona wasn't the first place on the list. They talked about other states. Places where ministry friends lived. Places with opportunities. But something about Arizona kept coming up. The pace was slower. The weather was different. The air felt freer. It wasn't an escape. It was a reset. Packing day was strange. Some boxes were filled with simple things. Clothes, books, dishes. Others held pieces of their old life. Photographs from Daystar trips. Awards. Letters from viewers. Memories that couldn't be thrown away, but also couldn't come with the same meaning they once had. The drive west wasn't a fast one. They took their time. The long roads gave them space to think. Some miles passed in silence. Others were filled with talk about the future. Not the kind of future where everything is perfectly planned, but the kind where you start dreaming again. When they reached Chandler, it was almost quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat. No constant ringing phones. No last-minute production calls. No rush to make it to a studio before the cameras rolled. Their first home there wasn't huge. It didn't need to be. It wasn't about image anymore. It was about peace. They started small. Just the two of them, a few close friends, and a clear idea. They weren't going to build a copy of Daystar. They were going to build something real. Something that grew from honest conversations, not from pressure to perform. The first thing they did was set up a simple space to record. No fancy lights. No big set. Just microphones, chairs, and the will to speak openly. That space became the start of their podcast. The first public step into their own ministry. It was different from TV. There was no time limit. No commercial breaks. No one cutting parts out. If Jonathan wanted to take 30 minutes to tell a story, he could. If Suzy wanted to pray for someone by name, she could. From there, invitations started coming in. Small churches, conferences, gatherings where they could look people in the eye. One of the biggest early moments was the Restore conference in Chandler. Standing on that stage wasn't about fame. It was about planting a flag. It was saying, "We're here now. This is where God has placed us. This is our start." Some people in the crowd that day had followed them for years. Some had driven hours just to see if they were okay. Others were curious, wondering if the two of them would talk about Daystar or if they would just move forward. They didn't come to gossip. They came to share, to encourage, to remind people that you can lose a platform and still have a calling. That day in Chandler was the moment they stopped looking back. From then on, every step was forward. Jonathan and Suzy never set out to rebuild Daystar. They didn't want another network, another building full of staff, another machine that needed constant feeding. What they wanted was people. Their ministry now isn't about the size of the crowd. It's about the depth of the conversation. They speak in rooms where they can see every face. They sit in circles, not rows. They pray with people one by one, not just as a group. The podcast became their open door. It gave them a way to tell their story in their own words, to share what they've learned without fear of being cut off. It's not polished like TV, and that's the point. It's honest. From Chandler, they've started saying yes to the right invitations, not just the biggest ones. They've shown up for small churches that couldn't afford a big-name guest. They've spoken to groups that were hurting, lost, or just needed a voice of hope. The road ahead isn't easy. They don't have the resources they once had. They don't have the automatic audience of a global network. But they have freedom. And they have each other. When you strip away the lights, the cameras, and the headlines, that's what's left. Two people, a calling, and the courage to start again. This is their new chapter. Not written by a network. Not controlled by a boardroom. Written by them, and the people they meet along the way. Jonathan and Suzy Lamb are no longer former Daystar hosts. They're leaders of their own ministry, and for the first time in years, they're free to be who they really are.